Hey guys, tonight we are stepping away from the grand battles and the soaring cathedrals and into the murky, confusing, and often downright bizarre world of medieval law. When you think of justice in the Middle Ages, you might picture a stern king on a throne, a knight defending his honor in a duel, or perhaps the grim silhouette of a gallows on a lonely hill. And you wouldn't be entirely wrong. The truth, as always, is far stranger and more complicated. Medieval law wasn't a neat book of rules. It was a chaotic stew of ancient custom, religious dogma, royal whim, and village superstition, all stirred together in a pot that was constantly simmering with conflict. It was a world where animals could be put on trial, where you could be fined for wearing the wrong color of socks, and where your innocence might depend on whether you could hold a red-hot iron without getting burned. It was a system of justice where God was often the final judge, and the evidence was, let's just say it was creative. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're retuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now, dim the lights. Maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Imagine for a moment you're a simple Anglo-Saxon farmer in England, sometime around the year 1070. Life is difficult. The recent Norman conquest has turned your world upside down. New lords, speaking a harsh French dialect, now own the land your family has worked for generations. They have new rules, new taxes, and a general air of being better than you. One misty morning, while walking to your fields, you stumble upon something in a ditch. It's a body. And by the fancy tunic and the neatly trimmed mustache, you can tell he's not a local. He is, without a doubt, a Norman. Your first instinct after the initial shock is not to call for the sheriff. It's to run. You run back to your village not to raise the alarm, but to gather your neighbors and start a very serious, very panicked discussion about what to do next. Because you've each just become subject to one of the most clever and oppressive laws of the early medieval period, the Murdrum Fine. This is the first strange legal concept we need to understand. In the wake of the Norman conquest of 1066, William the Conqueror faced a serious problem. His victorious but vastly outnumbered Norman knights and officials were scattered across a resentful and hostile English population. Secret killings were common. A Norman lord might go for a ride in the woods and never return, his body found weeks later, or not at all. To combat this guerrilla resistance, a new law was introduced. The mainstream historical fact is that the Murdrum Fine was a form of collective punishment. If a Norman was found murdered and the killer could not be immediately produced, the entire local community, the administrative district known as 100, was forced to pay a cripplingly large fine to the king. We're talking about an amount that could bankrupt an entire village for years, forcing them to sell land, livestock, and whatever meager possessions they had. The logic was simple. If the fine was painful enough, the community would have a very strong incentive to either find the killer themselves or, better yet, prevent the killing from happening in the first place. Now, here's where it gets particularly bizarre. There was one way out of the fine. The community could escape the penalty if they could prove that the dead person was English. This process was known as presentment of Englishry. Suddenly, every unsolved murder became a frantic exercise in post-mortem genealogy. Imagine the scene. The local reeve, a few village elders, and a very nervous group of farmers standing over a corpse, debating its ethnic origins. Well, his hair is a bit fair, but his nose has a rather Norman arch to it, don't you think? It was a grim and often impossible task. After a few days, proving anything definitive about a body in a ditch was nearly impossible. This little detail made the law even more effective as an instrument of control. It wasn't really a loophole. It was a cruel joke, trying to explain to the king's sheriff that the dead gentleman in the woods was definitely a local boy, named Ethelred, who just happened to enjoy fine French wine and fancy shoes, was a tough sell. This brings us to a fascinating academic debate. For a long time, historians saw the Murdrum Fine as a straightforward tool of brutal oppression. A conqueror's law designed to protect the ruling class and crush the spirit of the conquered Anglo-Saxons. It was seen as purely punitive, a way for the Norman kings to assert their dominance and fill their coffers at the same time. However, more recent scholarship offers a more nuanced view. Some historians now argue that, while the law was certainly oppressive, it was also a remarkably sophisticated piece of legal and administrative engineering. Instead of trying to police the entire country with a limited number of his own men, William the Conqueror effectively outsourced the job. The Murdrum Fine forced English communities to police themselves. It made collaboration with the new regime a matter of economic survival. Debate, therefore, shifts from whether the law was cruel. It undeniably was to whether its primary purpose was subjugation or a pragmatic, if ruthless, attempt at establishing order in a fractured and violent kingdom. It was a law that cared less about who committed the crime and more about ensuring the stability of the system. Classic medieval trade-off of individual justice for collective security. You, the farmer who found the body, are now in a terrible position. If you report it, you and your neighbors face financial ruin. If you hide it, and it's discovered later, you could be accused of the murder yourself. So the village does what many villages did. They hold a quiet meeting, and the body disappears. Be it's buried deep in the woods, may it's weighed down with stones and dropped into a bog. It's a risky gambit, but it's better than the alternative. And for the next few months, everyone in the village is exceptionally polite to any Normans passing through, offering them ale directions and nervous smiles. Everyone suddenly becomes an expert in Norman spotting, not to cause trouble, but to prevent it. There's a Norman heading toward the old mill, someone might whisper. Someone go make sure he doesn't trip. It was a strange, tense existence. All thanks to a law that turned every citizen into a reluctant detective, and every stranger into a potential financial catastrophe. So, your village has narrowly avoided financial ruin by cleverly disposing of an inconvenient Norman corpse. And an uneasy peace settles over the misty fields once more. But what happens when the crime can't be hidden? What happens when you, personally, are accused of something? Perhaps your neighbor claims you stole his prize-winning pig, or the baker insists you used witchcraft to make his bread refuse to rise. In a world without forensic science, without detectives, without even a reliable court system as we'd know it, how is your guilt or innocence determined? You might hope for a trial with a jury of your peers, but in the early Middle Ages, you're more likely to face something far more intimidating, and frankly, a lot hotter. You're facing the trial by ordeal, a judicial practice where the final verdict wasn't delivered by a judge, but by God himself, using the elements of fire and water as his chosen instruments of justice. The mainstream historical understanding of trial by ordeal is that it was a deeply ingrained judicial custom, particularly between the 9th and early 13th centuries. When a person was accused of a crime, and there was no conclusive evidence or witness, testimony a very common situation, the court could turn to divine judgment. The accused would be subjected to a painful and dangerous physical test, and the outcome was believed to reveal God's will. The most common forms were the ordeal of hot iron and the ordeal of hot or cold water. In the ordeal of hot iron, you would be forced to carry a piece of red-hot iron for a set distance, usually a few paces. Your hand would then be bandaged and sealed. 3 days later, the bandages would be removed in front of the priest and the community. If the wound was healing cleanly, God had proclaimed you innocent. If it was festering and infected, well, you were guilty, and you now also had a severely burned, infected hand to deal with before your execution. The ordeal by water had 2 main variations. In hot water, you'd have to plunge your arm into a cauldron of boiling water to retrieve a stone. The same 3-day waiting period for healing applied. In the ordeal of cold water, you were bound and thrown into a river or a pond that had been blessed by the priest. If you sank, the holy water had accepted you, and you were declared innocent. Though you still had the secondary problem of being at the bottom of a river, if you floated, the holy water had rejected you, proving your guilt. Now for the truly strange and lesser-known detail of these divine trials, the ordeal of the cursed morsel, or the coarsened. This was a special ordeal usually reserved for the clergy, who, you might imagine, weren't terribly keen on the whole boiling water and hot iron business. In this ordeal, the accused priest would be given a small piece of bread, often barley bread or cheese, that had been consecrated by another priest. During a solemn mass, the accused would pray to God that if he were guilty, he should choke on the morsel or be unable to swallow it. He would then attempt to eat the bread. If it went down smoothly, he was innocent. If he choked, gagged, or otherwise failed to consume the divine snack, he was guilty. It was, in essence, a divinely sanctioned gag reflex test. The most famous, though likely legendary, account of this ordeal involves Earl Godwin of Wessex, the father-in-law of King Edward the Confessor. Accused of murdering the king's brother, Godwin allegedly took the consecrated bread and swore, "May this morsel be my last if I am guilty," whereupon he immediately choked and died. It's a story that perfectly illustrates the medieval belief that God was an active participant in the justice system, even down to the level of clearing your throat. This brings us to the core academic debate surrounding trial by ordeal. For centuries, the prevailing view was that these practices were nothing more than barbaric superstition. Historians saw them as irrational, cruel, and essentially a form of judicial lottery, where the innocent suffered terribly alongside the guilty. It was viewed as a primitive relic of a dark and unenlightened age. However, in recent decades, scholars like Peter Brown have presented a radical reinterpretation. This modern view argues that trial by ordeal, far from being irrational, was a sophisticated and psychologically potent social ritual. It was a last resort, used only when all other forms of evidence had failed. Its true function wasn't necessarily to determine guilt, but to restore peace and consensus to a fractured community. The very threat of the ordeal was a powerful tool for eliciting confessions. Faced with the prospect of carrying a hot iron, many a guilty person would simply confess their crime. Furthermore, the process wasn't as random as it seems. The priest held immense power, consecrated the elements, oversaw the ritual, and most importantly, judged the healing of the wound after 3 days. A priest could be influenced by his knowledge of the accused character, by public opinion, or by political pressure. The signs of clean healing could be interpreted with a degree of flexibility. A minor infection might be overlooked for a well-liked individual, while any hint of pus on the hand of a village outcast would be declared a clear sign of guilt from on high. So in this revised view, the ordeal was less a direct conversation with God and more a priest-mediated community referendum. Wrapped in the terrifying and awe-inspiring theater of divine judgment, provided a definitive, divinely sanctioned answer that everyone in the community had to accept, allowing life to move on. It was a joke among medievalists that your chances in a trial by ordeal depended less on your innocence and more on whether you remembered to make a generous donation to the church roof fund the previous week. In a world of uncertainty, the ordeal provided a terrible final, and universally accepted certainty, which was a kind of mercy in itself. You've narrowly survived your trial by ordeal. Your hand is miraculously healing, and the village has accepted that you are, in fact, innocent of stealing that prize-winning pig. You can now return to your quiet life of toil, prayer, and avoiding puddles of raw sewage in the street. You've earned a bit of money from a good harvest, and you decide to treat yourself. You head to the market, your eyes set on a bolt of bright scarlet wool to make a new tunic. It's expensive, but you feel you deserve it. As you're about to make the purchase, however, the merchant eyes you up and down, shakes his head, and refuses to sell it to you. Why? Because you, a simple farmer, are not legally allowed to wear the color red. Welcome to the world of sumptuary laws, where your wardrobe was not your own business, but a matter of state-enforced social order. In medieval Europe, what you wore was a public declaration of who you were, and the ruling classes were terrified of anyone sending the wrong message. The mainstream historical fact is that sumptuary laws were regulations designed to control consumption and luxury, most often by restricting the types of clothing, fabrics, and even foods that different social classes were permitted to enjoy. These laws were intended to make the social hierarchy instantly visible and to prevent the lower and middle classes from imitating the aristocracy. If a wealthy merchant's wife showed up to church in a velvet gown trimmed with ermine, how could anyone tell she wasn't a duchess? It was a recipe for social chaos, or at least that was the fear. So governments and local councils stepped in to micromanage everyone's closet. Certain colors, like scarlet and purple, were reserved for royalty and the highest nobility. Luxurious imported fabrics like silk and velvet, or expensive furs like ermine and sable, were forbidden to commoners. The laws could be incredibly specific, dictating the length of a woman's train, the number of buttons on a man's doublet, or the quality of the linen in your undergarments. This brings us to one of the most famously bizarre expressions of sumptuary law, the regulation of shoe points. In the 14th and 15th centuries, a fashion craze for ridiculously long-toed shoes, known as poulines or cracos, swept across Europe. The points of these shoes became so exaggerated, sometimes extending a foot or more beyond the toes, that they became a walking hazard and a moral panic. Lawmakers, ever vigilant against signs of vanity, stepped in. In England, for example, 1463 law stipulated the acceptable length of a shoe's point based on social rank. A lord could wear points of any length. A knight or esquire could have points up to 2 feet long. A gentleman or merchant 1 foot, and a commoner was limited to a mere 6 inches. It was a system that created a whole new kind of social anxiety. Imagine getting dressed for a festival and wondering, is my shoe point too ostentatious for my station? Do I look like I'm aspiring to be a baron when I am clearly just a well-to-do tanner? The church, for its part, hated them. Preachers thundered that these pointy shoes were so prideful they prevented men from being able to kneel properly to pray, which, to be fair, was probably accurate. The traditional academic view of sumptuary laws is that their primary purpose was to maintain the rigid social order. They were a tool of the aristocracy to visually enforce class distinctions and put the increasingly wealthy merchant class back in their place. In a world where society was seen as a divinely ordained hierarchy, with kings at the top and peasants at the bottom, blurring those lines through clothing was seen as a threat to the very fabric of existence. However, a more modern historical interpretation suggests there was a powerful economic motive at play as well. Many sumptuary laws, particularly in places like England and Italy, specifically restricted imported luxuries. By forbidding the general population from buying foreign silks or Flemish furs, these laws effectively forced consumers to buy local products, like good English wool. This protected domestic industries, kept money within the kingdom, and acted as an early form of economic protectionism. So, the debate continues. Were these laws about preserving social snobbery, or were they about protecting the national economy? The likely answer is a bit of both. It was a way for the elite to stay exclusive, while also ensuring the local shepherd had a market for his fleece. Of course, passing a law is one thing, enforcing it is another. For every earnest official trying to measure shoe points in the town square, there were a dozen crafty individuals finding ways to get around the rules. This led to a golden age of fashion rebellion. You couldn't wear velvet. Fine, you'd wear a new kind of heavily processed wool that looked almost like velvet. Forbidden to wear gold embroidery, you'd use shimmering yellow silk thread that caught the light in just the right way. Some women wore their prohibited fabrics as hidden linings in their gowns, a secret luxury no one could see, but that they knew was there. It was a cat-and-mouse game of sartorial defiance. The punishment for being caught could range from a simple fine to the public confiscation and destruction of your offending garment, which must have been a truly mortifying experience. Despite the risks, the rising merchant class continued to push the boundaries, using fashion as their primary weapon in the slow, silent war for social status. Their wealth came from commerce, not land, and a spectacular new outfit was the quickest way to announce that you had arrived. And the nobility, in turn, reacted by making their own fashions even more outrageous and expensive, just to stay one step ahead. It was an arms race of hemlines and hats, and the sumptuary laws were little more than speed bumps. It's the medieval equivalent of a no-running sign by a swimming pool. It was a nice idea that everyone cheerfully ignored the second the authorities weren't looking. You've learned your lesson. You've returned the scarlet wool, settled for a respectable, law-abiding beige, and resisted the urge to sew a dangerously long point onto your shoe. You've navigated the treacherous world of medieval fashion, but the law isn't finished with you yet. It doesn't just govern what you wear, it governs where you can go and what you can do. One afternoon, seeking to supplement your meager dinner of turnip stew, you decide to take a walk in the nearby woods. A rabbit scampers across your path and you think, a simple snare, a bit of luck, and we eat meat tonight. It seems harmless enough. But as you step off the path and into the dappled shade of the trees, you've just broken one of the most feared and hated laws in all of medieval England. You have entered the royal forest. This is where medieval law gets even stranger and more terrifying. The mainstream historical fact is that a forest in medieval times was unnecessarily a dense woodland. It was a specific legal term for a vast area of land which could include woods, open fields, moors, and even entire villages that was set aside for the king's exclusive hunting pleasure.
Roughly a third of England was designated as royal forest at one point.
Within these boundaries, a completely separate and much harsher set of rules known as the forest law applied. The purpose of this law was simple: to protect the venison and the vert, the deer, and other game animals, and the green vegetation they needed to survive. The king and his chosen nobles were the only ones allowed to hunt here. For you, a commoner, killing a deer in a royal forest was a crime more heinous than killing a man. At least if you killed a man, his family might accept a payment of wergold, or man price. If you killed one of the king's stags, you could be blinded, castrated, or simply executed. Now for the peculiar and brutal details, the forest law was ruthlessly specific. It wasn't just hunting that was forbidden. Couldn't clear land for farming, build a fence, or even gather fallen firewood without a license from the king's foresters, who were notoriously corrupt and unforgiving. But perhaps the most bizarre rule concerned dogs. If you were a peasant living within or near the forest, you were allowed to own a dog for protection or herding. However, you had to ensure it couldn't possibly chase the king's precious deer. The solution was a practice known as lawing or expeditation. Every 3 years, the forest court would convene, and every dog over a certain size had to be brought forward. A forester would then place the dog's paw on a piece of wood and, with a chisel and mallet, chop off 3 claws from its forefoot. This brutal mutilation made it impossible for the dog to run at speed, ensuring it could never pose a threat to the venison. It was a system that guaranteed the king's deer remained blissfully unstressed, and the village dogs developed a permanent and very understandable limp. The academic debate around forest law is fascinating. The traditional view has always been that it was an instrument of pure royal tyranny. It was seen as a selfish and oppressive system that prioritized the king's sport over the survival of his people. Peasants who relied on the woods for food, fuel, and grazing for their animals were suddenly turned into criminals, their livelihoods destroyed for the sake of a nobleman's afternoon hunt. The law was a constant source of resentment and fueled the popular image of outlaws like Robin Hood, who famously defied the cruel sheriff of Nottingham by poaching the king's deer to feed the poor. This view sees the forest as a symbol of the deep injustice of the feudal system. However, a more recent and somewhat controversial school of thought argues that the forest law, for all its brutality, had an unintended and profoundly modern consequence: environmental conservation. By placing huge swaths of the country under this strict, centrally controlled legal system, the Norman and Plantagenet kings inadvertently created massive nature preserves. Because farming, settlement, and resource extraction were so heavily restricted, these forests were protected from the deforestation and development that was happening elsewhere. The law, designed to protect deer for the hunt, ended up preserving ancient woodlands, wetlands, and the biodiversity within them. Historians in this camp don't deny the law's cruelty, but they suggest its legacy is more complex. It was an act of royal greed that accidentally became one of Europe's largest and longest-running conservation projects. The debate pits social justice against ecological outcomes, asking whether a tyrannical law can be forgiven if it ends up saving a forest. Back in the woods, you, the peasant with the snare, are starting to sweat. You hear the distant sound of a horn. It could be a hunter, or worse, a forester on patrol. You quickly pull back your snare and scramble out of the trees, your heart pounding. You didn't get your rabbit, but you still have your eyesight and all of your fingers, which counts as a win for the day. You return to your village and see your neighbor, his old dog hobbling beside him, its paw forever maimed by the law. You think about the absurdity of it all. A world where the life of a deer is valued more highly than the well-being of a dog or even a person. You understand, with a fresh wave of quiet despair, that the law in your world isn't about what's right or wrong. It's about who has the power to make the rules. And in the king's forest, the only law that matters is the law of the hunt. The fear of the forest law keeps you out of the woods, and you resign yourself to a life of turnip-based cuisine. It was a close call. You almost lost your life over a rabbit. But this brings up a darker, stranger question. In a world where killing a deer could get you executed, what happened if you actually killed a person?
How?
Surely the punishment for that would be even more severe. The answer is, it depends on who you killed, and more importantly, how much money you had. Before the Normans arrived with their centralized, king-focused laws, early medieval justice, especially in Anglo-Saxon England and other Germanic societies, operated on a very different and deeply strange principle. If you killed someone, you didn't necessarily go to jail or the gallows. Instead, you paid a fine, a very, very large fine. This was the system of wergild. The mainstream historical fact is that wergild, which literally translates to man price or man payment, was a legal mechanism for restorative justice. Its primary purpose was to prevent the endless bloody cycles of family-on-family violence known as blood feuds. Imagine your cousin gets killed in a tavern brawl. Your family's honor demands revenge, so you kill one of the perpetrator's relatives. Then their family retaliates, and soon enough, entire villages are engaged in a multi-generational vendetta. Wergild was designed to stop this. Instead of seeking revenge through violence, the victim's family was entitled to a set amount of financial compensation from the killer's family. It was a strange sort of justice system, part courtroom, part insurance claim, and part butcher shop price list. Crucially, the amount of wergild was entirely dependent on the social status of the person who was killed. A king's life was worth a fortune, an amount so impossibly high it was almost symbolic. A nobleman, or thane, was worth a substantial sum. Free peasant or churl was worth considerably less, and a slave. Well, a slave had no wergild at all. Their death was simply a property loss for their owner. This is where the law descends into the truly bizarre and macabre. It wasn't just a price for a life. It was a detailed tariff for specific injuries. The law codes from this period read like a gruesome catalog of bodily harm with a price tag attached to every part. The loss of an eye would cost you a certain amount of silver shillings. A hand was worth more, foot even more. Losing a thumb was particularly expensive, as it impacted a man's ability to hold a sword or, perhaps more critically for a peasant, a shovel. The value of your body parts was directly linked to their utility and your social standing. Even teeth had their own pricing scheme. Knocking out someone's front tooth was a more costly offense than knocking out a molar, presumably for aesthetic reasons. Every limb, every finger, every sense had a monetary value assigned to it by law. It was a system where an eye for an eye could be neatly negotiated down to an eye for about 20 shillings and a decent goat. If you're a good haggler, this leads to the central academic debate about the nature of wergild. The older, more romanticized interpretation of this system praises it as a remarkably sophisticated and even enlightened form of early justice. Proponents of this view argue that it was a pragmatic and effective way to maintain social cohesion in a violent world. By replacing the chaotic cycle of blood feuds with a structured system of compensation, wergild prevented society from tearing itself apart. It offered a path to reconciliation, allowing families to settle disputes and restore honor without resorting to endless killing. In this light, wergild is seen as a move toward civilization, a step away from pure vengeance and toward a community-based legal framework. However, the more critical, modern perspective paints a much darker picture. This view argues that wergild, far from being a system of justice, was a system that legally enshrined inequality. It essentially made justice a commodity that could be bought and sold. If you were a wealthy nobleman and you killed a peasant in a fit of rage, you didn't face a murder charge. You just paid a relatively minor fee. It was an inconvenience, not a deterrent. For the rich, murder was affordable. Conversely, if a poor peasant injured a nobleman, say, by accidentally knocking out one of his very expensive front teeth, a peasant, sa family could be financially ruined for generations trying to pay the exorbitant compensation. If they couldn't pay, they could be forced into debt, bondage, or sold into servitude. In this interpretation, wergild was not a tool for peace, but a weapon of class oppression. It was a system that explicitly stated in the language of the law that the life and body of a rich man were worth vastly more than the life and body of a poor man. The debate, then, is whether wergild was a civilizing force that prevented feuds, or a brutal mechanism that allowed the wealthy to commit violence with impunity. You can see the dilemma. On one hand, the system probably did reduce the number of revenge killings. On the other, it created a world where a rich man could, quite literally, get away with murder. As Norman influence grew and the king's law began to supersede old customs, The practice of war gold slowly faded, replaced by a system where crimes like murder were seen as offenses against the king's peace to be punished by the state. But for centuries, your value as a human being was not an abstract concept. It was a specific number, written down in a law book, waiting to be paid out should the worst happen. And you just had to hope that you were worth enough to matter, or at least not so little that hurting you was cheap. The Wargold system may have put a price on your body parts, but at least it recognized you as a person with a specific value. That is, if you were a man. The law had a very different and even more complicated view of the other half of the population. If you were a woman in the Middle Ages, your legal identity was often a fragile, borrowed thing, dependent entirely on the men in your life. The law didn't just restrict you. In many ways, it acted as if you barely existed at all. You went from being your father's daughter to your husband's wife, your legal status shifting like property from one owner to the next. Legally, you were less of a person and more of a human accessory that came with a dowry. The mainstream legal principle that governed a woman's life, particularly in Norman England, was known as coverture. The term comes from the Norman French for to cover. Once a woman married, her legal identity was completely subsumed or covered by that of her husband. She became a femme covert, a covered woman. This meant she could not own property in her own name, enter into contracts, sue someone in court, or even write a will without her husband's permission. Any land or wealth she brought into the marriage immediately became his to control. Earnings, if she had any, belonged to him. In the eyes of the law, husband and wife were one person, and that one person was the husband. This wasn't just a social custom. It was the bedrock of common law, a system that effectively rendered married women legal non-entities, perpetually under the guardianship of a man. While coverture was the overarching rule, the law found plenty of other, more creative ways to control women's behavior. This brings us to a truly bizarre and cruel instrument of public punishment, the scold's bridle, sometimes known as the Brank's bridle. This was a punishment reserved almost exclusively for women who were deemed to be scolds, nags, or public nuisances, women who argued, gossiped too much, or otherwise challenged male authority with their words. The bridle was a horrifying iron cage or mask that was locked onto the woman's head. The most crucial feature was a metal plate or spike, often called a bit, that was forced into her mouth and pressed down on her tongue, making speech impossible. The woman would then be paraded through the town, led by a rope, to be mocked and humiliated by her neighbors. It was a remarkably effective, if terrifying, method for winning an argument.
Ow.
It's hard to get the last word in when you're re-wearing a metal helmet with a built-in tongue depressor. The purpose was clear: to publicly shame and physically silence women whose speech was considered disruptive to the social order. This grim reality leads us directly to a major academic debate about the lives of medieval women. For a long time, the historical narrative, based primarily on legal texts and church documents, portrayed medieval women as almost completely powerless victims of an oppressive patriarchal system. They were seen as passive figures, confined to the domestic sphere, with no legal rights, no economic power, and no voice. The laws of coverture and punishments like the scold bridle were presented as proof of their total subjugation. This traditional view painted a picture of medieval womanhood as a long, unbroken story of silent suffering. However, over the past few decades, a new generation of historians, using a much wider range of sources, including personal letters, guild records, archaeological finds, and even art, has crafted a much more complex and empowering narrative. This revisionist history doesn't deny the legal and social disadvantages women faced, but it argues that despite these constraints, many women found remarkable ways to exercise agency, influence, and power. They were not just passive victims, they were resilient agents. For instance, in towns and cities, women were active in commerce. Widows in particular, who were not under the cover of a husband, could inherit and run their late husband's business, becoming respected members of craft guilds and the business community. Women dominated certain trades like brewing ale, spinning, and weaving. They managed large and complex households, which were the economic engines of the medieval world, controlling budgets and supply chains with formidable skill. And for some, the church offered an alternative path to power. Entering a convent allowed a woman to escape the inevitability of marriage and childbirth, gain an education, and in the case of an abbess, command immense wealth, land, and authority. The debate, therefore, is not whether the laws were oppressive, they were, but whether we should define medieval women by the laws designed to restrain them, or by the myriad ways they managed to live, work, and thrive in spite of them. Were they footnotes in a man's world, or the uncredited authors of their own stories? Proving once again that while the law might try to silence women, it rarely succeeded for long. There was always a whispered rumor, a shared secret, or a pot of bad ale brewed with just a little extra. You've been paraded through the village in a scold's bridle for speaking your mind, and you've learned a hard lesson about the limits of free speech in the medieval world. The law, it seems, has an iron grip on every aspect of your life. But what if you could escape it? What if there was a place you could run, a legal loophole you could exploit, that would snatch you from the grasp of the king's justice? In the complex legal landscape of the Middle Ages, such places and loopholes did exist, and they were often centered on the one institution that could stand against the power of a king, the church. If you were in real trouble, your best bet wasn't a good lawyer. It was a fast horse and the nearest church bell. The mainstream historical fact is that the practice of sanctuary was a deeply rooted legal principle throughout medieval Christendom. If you were accused of a crime, from theft to murder, you could flee to a church, an abbey, or any other piece of consecrated ground. Once you physically touched the church grounds, sometimes grabbing the sanctuary ring on the church door, you were officially under the protection of God and the church. Secular authorities, like the local sheriff, were forbidden from forcibly arresting you there. It was the medieval equivalent of calling base. In a game of tag, except the person who was a very angry man with a warrant for your arrest and the authority to hang you. You weren't home free, however. Sanctuary was temporary. You typically had a period of 40 days to decide your fate. During this time, you could try to negotiate a pardon, or you could agree to abjure the realm, that is, confess your crime, forfeit all your property to the crown, and go into permanent exile, walking barefoot and carrying a wooden cross to the nearest port to sail away, never to return. If you refused to leave, or were caught after returning, you could be killed on sight. This leads us to an even stranger-related legal loophole: the benefit of clergy. This was a provision in the law that originally stipulated that members of the clergy, priests, monks, deacons could not be tried in the king's secular courts. Instead, they had the right to be tried in the much more lenient ecclesiastical courts run by the church. Church courts could not sentence a man to death. The worst punishments they typically handed out were fines, penance, or defrocking. This created a highly desirable, two-tiered justice system. But how did you prove you were a member of the clergy? In an age before ID cards, the test was surprisingly simple. You had to read. Since the vast majority of the population was illiterate, the ability to read, specifically Latin, was considered proof positive of a clerical education. An accused man would be handed a Bible, usually opened to a specific passage, and asked to read it aloud. This passage became known as the neck verse, because successfully reading it could literally save your neck from the hangman's noose. The most common verse was the first line of Psalm 51. Miserere me Deus, secundum magnum misericordiam tuum tome. It led to a rather odd situation where a man's life could depend not on his innocence, but on his ability to sound out a bit of Latin he'd been furiously practicing in a tavern the night before. This brings us to the academic debate over the function of these ecclesiastical get-out-of-jail-free cards. The traditional view, held by many legal historians, is that sanctuary and the benefit of clergy were massive, destabilizing flaws in the medieval justice system. They saw them as loopholes that allowed hardened criminals to escape punishment, undermining the king's authority and turning churches into dens of thieves. In this interpretation, these practices were a constant source of conflict between the crown and the church, with kings like Henry II famously battling with archbishops like Thomas Becket over the right to try criminous clerks. These laws, it was argued, made a mockery of justice and created chaos. However, a more revisionist historical perspective argues that these practices, while seemingly chaotic, served a vital social function. They acted as a crucial safety valve in an otherwise incredibly brutal and inflexible legal system. Sanctuary, for example, prevented instant hot-blooded justice and mob violence. The 40-day waiting period allowed tempers to cool and provided time for negotiation, mediation, and less violent resolutions, like exile. It was a form of mercy, an institutional pause button in a world of swift, harsh punishments. Similarly, the benefit of clergy, while a clear loophole, may have had the unintended effect of protecting England's small but vital educated class. It wasn't just priests who could read. It was also clerks, scholars, administrators, and tutors. By allowing any literate man to claim benefit of clergy, the law protected these essential individuals from a secular justice system that was often arbitrary, and did not distinguish between a drunken brawl and a capital crime. It created a system with two tracks, one for those who couldn't read, which often ended with a rope, and one for those who could, which often ended with a stern lecture from a bishop and a few extra prayers as penance. One was clearly preferable. In this view, these legal quirks weren't bugs in the system. They were features, providing a necessary element of mercy and flexibility in a harsh world. So, was it a broken system or a balanced one? The answer, like most things in the Middle Ages, is a confusing and fascinating yes. You've successfully memorized the neck verse, just in case you're ever accused of a crime you didn't commit, or more likely, one you did. You understand that in the medieval world, the law has different paths for different people. The church offers one escape route, the king's law another. But what about a defendant who couldn't possibly read a line of Latin? What about an accused criminal who couldn't claim sanctuary, couldn't understand the charges, and whose only defense was a blank stare or a confused grunt? What happened when the perpetrator wasn't a person at all, but a pig? This isn't a hypothetical question. Welcome to the astonishingly real and utterly bizarre world of medieval animal trials. The mainstream historical fact, as strange as it sounds, is that from the 13th to the 18th century, in many parts of Europe, animals were formally prosecuted for crimes. We're not talking about a farmer simply dispatching a troublesome bull. We are talking about full-scale legal proceedings. Animals, from pigs and cows to rats, weevils, and locusts, could be arrested, imprisoned, provided with a lawyer, tried before a judge, and if found guilty, sentenced to public execution. It was a system that took the right to a fair trial, to a whole new and frankly agricultural level. These weren't mock trials for village entertainment. They were serious legal procedures, often meticulously recorded in court documents that survive to this day. A pig that killed a child, for instance, wouldn't just be killed. It would be formally charged with murder, held in the local jail, and brought to trial, where witnesses would testify against it. This brings us to one of the most famous and unsettlingly detailed cases. In 1386, in the town of Falaise, France, a sow was put on trial for having attacked and fatally mauled an infant. The court records are incredibly thorough. Pig was arrested and held in the local prison at the expense of the state. During the trial, it was represented by a court-appointed lawyer who, we can only assume, did his best to argue his client's case. Perhaps he argued that the pig had a difficult upbringing, or that the child was clearly encroaching on its trough space. Despite the legal defense, the sow was found guilty of murder. The sentence was public execution. But here's the truly surreal detail. Before being hanged in the town square, the pig was dressed in human clothes, including a waistcoat and breeches. This act of dressing the animal was likely symbolic, meant to anthropomorphize it and emphasize that it was being punished for a human-like crime, thereby satisfying the community's need for recognizable justice. The existence of animal trials has long been a source of fascination and debate among historians. The older, or literal interpretation, was that medieval people genuinely believed that animals possessed moral agency, a soul, and therefore the capacity to commit sin. In this view, a pig that killed a child was not just a dangerous animal. It was a murderer in the truest sense, morally culpable and deserving of the same judicial process and punishment as a human. This perspective saw the trials as a relic of a pre-rational, superstitious worldview, where the lines between the human, animal, and divine realms were hopelessly blurred. However, modern historians and anthropologists have offered a more symbolic interpretation. They argue that these trials were not really about the animal's guilt. Instead, they were complex social rituals designed to restore order and meaning to a community after a shocking or traumatic event. When a pig killed a child, it was a horrifying violation of the natural order. A domestic animal, a source of food, had turned into a monster. The trial was a way for the community to process this horror, to ritually cleanse itself, and to publicly re-establish human dominance over the animal world. By putting the animal through the entire human legal process: arrest, trial, defense, sentencing, execution, the community was performing a kind of social theater. It was a way of saying, this terrible, unnatural thing has happened, but we are in control. We have laws, we have justice, we are restoring order. The execution of the animal, particularly a public and ceremonial one, served as a powerful symbolic act that provided a sense of closure and catharsis for the grieving community. In this view, the trial was for the benefit of the humans, not the pig. Imagine being a villager witnessing such an event. The solemn procession, the judge in his robes, the pig in its little waistcoat being led to the gallows. It must have been an unforgettable spectacle. And if the guilty party was not a single animal, but a swarm of pests, it's like weevils infesting a granary or locusts destroying crops, the case would be brought before the ecclesiastical court. The church would formally excommunicate the insects, ordering them to leave the parish within a set number of days under penalty of being anathematized. The court would even appoint a lawyer to represent the weevils, who might argue that his clients were also God's creatures and had a right to eat. It was a legal system that had an answer for everything, even a plague of caterpillars. Ultimately, if found guilty, the animal was punished, sending a clear message to all the other livestock in the village: crime doesn't pay, and also stay away from unattended children. While the public execution of a pig in human clothes was certainly a memorable, if terrifying spectacle, it was a rare one. Your own daily life as a peasant was governed by a much more mundane, personal, and constant form of justice. You didn't worry about being tried for murder in the king's court. You worried about being fined for your wandering chickens in the Lord's court. This was the justice of the village, dispensed in the great hall of the manor, where the crimes were small, the passions were high, and the law was whatever the Lord's steward said it was that week. Welcome to the manorial court. The mainstream historical fact is that the manorial court was the lowest and most common court in the feudal system. Each manor, the estate controlled by a local lord, had its own court, which typically met a few times a year. Presided over by the lord or his appointed steward, this court wasn't for handling high treason or grand conspiracies. This was a court for settling the earth-shattering legal question of whether Thomas's cow had in fact trampled Agnes's vegetable patch. The court's business covered everything related to the functioning of the manor. It recorded land transfers, enforced the labor duties that peasants owed their lord, and settled minor disputes between the tenants. Attendance was usually compulsory for all the adult men of the manor, who acted as a sort of informal jury, and every decision was meticulously recorded in the manorial rolls, providing historians with a wonderfully detailed and often very petty glimpse into medieval village life. And the pettiness is where we find the bizarre details. The crimes brought before the manorial court reveal a world of intensely local concerns. You could be fined for brewing ale that was too weak or sold at the wrong price. You could be fined for letting your pig escape its sty and dig up the village green. You could be fined for failing to show up for your required labor on the Lord's land. A medieval version of playing hooky from work, but it went deeper. You could be fined for raising the hue and cry, without good reason, that is, for starting a panic. Women could be fined for being common scolds, or for gossiping maliciously. You could even be fined for things like taking too long of a lunch break while working the Lord's fields, a law that many modern office workers might find deeply, personally resonant. These records show a society where every aspect of life was interwoven and regulated, where your personal business, right down to the quality of your home brew, was the community's business. This leads us to a fascinating academic debate about the true purpose of the manorial court. The traditional view, popular for a long time, was that these courts were simply another tool of feudal oppression. They were the Lord's court, enforcing the Lord's will. Their primary function was to extract money and labor from a powerless peasantry. In this interpretation, the court was a mechanism for control, ensuring that tenants paid their rents, performed their duties, and never forgot who was in charge. The fines were seen not as justice, but as another form of taxation, and the entire system was designed to reinforce the rigid hierarchy of the feudal pyramid. However, more recent and detailed study of the manorial roles has led to a revisionist view. This perspective argues that while the court certainly served the lord's interests, it also functioned as a vital community forum where peasants could resolve their own disputes. The records show that the vast majority of cases were not the lord suing his tenants, but tenants suing each other. You would sue your neighbor for letting his cattle graze on your land for an unpaid debt of a few pennies, or for slanderously claiming that your meat pies contained more rat than rabbit. In this light, the court was less an instrument of pure oppression and more a crucial mechanism for self-regulation and conflict. Resolution at the village level. It was a place where ordinary people could seek justice, however imperfect, and maintain social harmony without resorting to violence. It was a place where justice was local, personal, and often involved a surprising amount of discussion about escaped chickens. It was less a grand hall of justice and more a highly structured, legally binding village meeting with fines. So, you find yourself summoned to the court, and maybe your dog chased the lord's sheep, or maybe you just failed to mend your section of the village fence. You stand before the steward and a jury of your neighbors, the same people you share ale with in the evening and compete with at the annual turnip festival. The proceedings are in a confusing mix of Latin, Norman French, and your local English dialect. The steward, often the only truly literate man in the room, reads the charge. Witnesses are called. Your neighbor, Agnes, testifies that she saw your pig, a notorious troublemaker, digging near the lord's private meadow. You offer a weak defense, claiming it was a different, visually identical pig. The jury of your peers, after some deliberation, finds you guilty. The sentence: a fine of 1 penny, a significant sum that you'll be grumbling about for weeks. You pay the fine, receive a stern warning, and return to your life, a little poorer, a little wiser, and with a newfound determination to build a better pigsty. It wasn't glorious, but it was justice, medieval village style. Your fine for the escaped pig still stings, but you've paid it, and the matter is settled. As you sit in the local tavern, nursing a cup of ale and trying to forget the humiliation, you become aware of another, even more pervasive set of laws. These aren't about your actions, but about the very substance of your daily life. What S in your cup and what S on your plate. You take a sip of the ale. It's a bit thin, a bit sour. You break off a piece of the dark, heavy bread on the table. It's gritty. And you realize with a sigh that even these simple necessities are policed, regulated, and subject to a bizarre and wonderful set of laws designed to protect you from the shadier side of medieval commerce. The mainstream historical fact is that authorities in medieval Europe, particularly in England, were deeply concerned with the quality of basic foodstuffs. This led to the creation of the Assize of Bread and Ale, a series of laws first codified in the 13th century that are considered among the first. Consumer protection regulations in history. Bread and ale were the absolute staples of the medieval diet, the fuel that powered the entire country. The assize tied the price and weight of a loaf of bread directly to the price of grain. As the price of wheat or barley went up or down, the legal size of a standard loaf of bread would change accordingly. This was meant to ensure a just price and prevent bakers from gouging the poor during times of scarcity. The law was so detailed it would make a modern food safety inspector's head spin. All to protect you from being sold a loaf that was 90% sawdust and 10% pure disappointment. Special officials, sometimes called elk-conners or bread weighers, were appointed to enforce these standards. The punishments for breaking the assize were where the law got truly creative and delightfully strange. If a baker was caught selling underweight loaves, or worse, adulterating his dough with things like dirt, chalk, or cobwebs, he faced public humiliation. A common punishment was to be placed in the pillory or stocks in the town square, with the offending loaf of bread hung around his neck for all his neighbors to see and mock. But the brewers, often women known as alewives, faced an even more spectacular punishment. If an alewife was found to be brewing weak, sour, or otherwise substandard ale, she could be sentenced to the cucking stool, also known as the ducking stool. This was a chair attached to a long wooden beam, which could be swung out over a river or a pond of stagnant water. The guilty brewer would be strapped into the chair and then repeatedly dunked into the filthy water. A punishment that gave a whole new meaning to the phrase drowning your sorrows. If your ale was bad enough, the town might just help you do it literally. This brings us to the academic debate about the primary motivation behind the assize of bread and ale. The traditional and more positive interpretation is that these laws were a genuinely progressive attempt at ensuring social justice and fairness. In this view, they represent an early form of consumer rights, designed to protect the most vulnerable members of society from exploitation. Life was hard enough for the common person without having to worry that their daily bread was half-baked or their ale was mostly ditch water. The laws, therefore, were a moral and ethical response to the realities of the medieval marketplace, an attempt by the authorities to enforce a standard of quality and a just price for the good of all. However, a more critical and political reading of the assize suggests that its motives were less about altruism and more about control and revenue. By standardizing the production of bread and ale, the crown made these vital industries much easier to regulate and, more importantly, to tax. Furthermore, the price of bread was a constant source of social tension. A sudden spike in bread prices was one of the most common triggers for urban riots and unrest. By legally tying the price of a loaf to the price of grain, the authorities could deflect public anger away from themselves and onto the bakers. The law became a tool for maintaining public order and political stability. Preventing bread riots was a top priority for any medieval ruler, making the assize a pragmatic instrument of social control, as much as a beacon of consumer protection. The debate is whether the king cared more about the quality of your loaf or the quietness of his kingdom. So you sit there in the tavern, contemplating your sour ale. You could report the alewife to the local ale cunner, but you know her. She's a widow with 5 children, and the grain prices have been high all season. You also know that a session in the cucking stool in this weather could kill her. On the other hand, the ale really is terrible. This was the constant dilemma for the medieval consumer. Do you enforce your rights and risk ruining a neighbor, or do you just quietly accept the subpar product? Most people grumbled, but let it slide unless the transgression was truly egregious. It was a self-policing system built on a delicate balance of community ties and personal tolerance for bad beer. And it ensured that while your bread might still be hard enough to use as a doorstop, it was at least a legally weighed, officially sanctioned doorstop. The fear of being punished for bad ale or underweight bread was a real concern for a medieval tradesperson. But it was part of a much larger, more terrifying legal web that ensnared rich and poor alike. The law of debt. In a world with unpredictable harvests, rampant disease, and the constant threat of war, falling into debt was incredibly easy. Getting out of it, however, was a nightmare. There were no modern bankruptcy laws to protect you, no way to simply declare your losses and start fresh. If you owed someone money, the law was squarely on the side of your creditor, and it had some very creative and frightening ways of ensuring they got what they were owed. The mainstream historical fact about medieval debt is that it was a catastrophic event from which it was almost impossible to recover. If you, a peasant farmer, couldn't pay your rent to the lord or repay a loan to a wealthier neighbor, your creditor had the legal right to seize everything you owned. This wasn't just your savings, it was your future. They could take your livestock, the cow that gave your children milk, the ox that pulled your plow. They could take your tools, your meager furniture, and the very grain you had stored to feed your family through the winter. Once you were stripped of your property and your means of making a living, you were left destitute, with few options other than begging or starving. It was a system with very high stakes. Forgetting to pay back your neighbor for that bushel of oats could result in your son spending the next 7 years as his unpaid farmhand. It certainly made you think twice before asking to borrow a cup of sugar. This leads us to the strange and disturbing detail of what happened when a debtor had no property left to seize. What happened when you had nothing left but the clothes on your back and your own body? In that case, the creditor could legally claim you. This is the origin of the pound of flesh concept, made famous by Shakespeare. While creditors couldn't literally take a pound of your flesh, they could legally take the next best thing, your labor. This was the law of debt bondage, or indentured servitude. If you couldn't pay your debt in coin, you would pay it with your body by working for your creditor for free until the debt was considered settled. This could be for a set number of years, or in many cases for the rest of your life. Your children could also be forced into servitude to pay off your debts, their future sold to settle your financial mistakes. It was a legal status that blurred the lines between freedom and slavery, turning a simple loan into a potential life sentence of unpaid toil. This frightening reality is at the center of a significant academic debate about the nature of unfree labor in the Middle Ages. The traditional historical view often groups all forms of servitude together, seeing little practical difference between serfdom, which tied a peasant to a piece of land, debt bondage, which tied a person to a creditor, and outright slavery. It was all seen as part of a single, monolithic feudal system designed to exploit the poor. In this view, debt bondage was just slavery by another name, a legal fiction that allowed the wealthy to own people without having to call it slavery. However, more recent scholarship has sought to draw finer distinctions between these different statuses. These historians argue that while all forms of servitude were exploitative, they were not the same. Serfdom was an inherited status tied to the land, while debt bondage was a personal contract entered into by an individual. They point out that from the perspective of a desperately poor person facing starvation, entering into debt bondage could have been a rational, if terrible, choice. It was a way to secure food and shelter from a creditor in exchange for labor. Some argue it was a survival strategy, a last resort in a world with no social safety net. The debate hinges on the question of choice. Was entering servitude a voluntary act to survive? Or was the choice between starvation and bondage an illusion, making it just a legally sanctioned form of slavery? It created a world where your financial ledger was intimately connected to your physical freedom. A bad year for turnips could easily turn into a long-term contract cleaning out your creditor's stables. It was a powerful incentive to be good at both farming and accounting. Imagine the sheer dread of it. Failed crop or a sick animal could plunge you into a debt you could never repay. You watch as the reeve comes to your home and leads away your only cow. A few months later, he returns to take your plow. Finally, with nothing left, you stand before your creditor, the wealthiest farmer in the village, and agree to work his fields for the next 5 years just to settle a debt of a few shillings. Your life is no longer your own. You wake before dawn to tend to his crops, not yours. You mend his fences, feed his pigs, and fall into your straw bed at night, exhausted, with nothing to show for it. But the slow, grinding payment of a debt that has consumed your freedom, this was the grim reality for thousands of medieval people caught in a legal trap that was as inescapable as it was cruel. You've managed to stay out of debt, and your freedom for now remains intact. You might think then that if life on your manor becomes too unbearable, you could simply pack your few belongings, whistle for your non-lawed dog, and seek a better life in the next town over. But you would be wrong. For most people in the Middle Ages, travel was not a right. It was a rare and dangerous privilege. The roads were treacherous, bandits were common, and the law itself often conspired to keep you exactly where you were born. Deciding to visit your cousin in the next village was a major undertaking, requiring more planning than a minor crusade, and with roughly the same chance of encountering trouble. The mainstream historical fact is that for the vast majority of the population, the serfs leaving the manor at all required the lord's permission. You were legally tied to the land you worked. Your lord could forbid you from moving, marrying someone from another village, or seeking work elsewhere. To leave without permission was to become a fugitive, subject to capture and punishment. Even for those who were technically free, travel was fraught with peril. The roads where they existed were often little more than muddy, rutted tracks. There were no maps, no signposts, and no highway patrol. Bandits and outlaws lurked in the forests, ready to prey on anyone who looked like they might have a few coins or a decent pair of shoes. Because of this danger, hospitality became a powerful social and religious obligation. Monasteries, in particular, were expected to provide food and shelter to travelers and pilgrims, offering a safe haven on a dangerous journey. This focus on where you could go and where you could stay led to some strangely specific laws about boundaries and property. One of the most curious of these was the law of eavesdrop. Found in Anglo-Saxon and later English law, this rule stated that you could not build your house so close to your neighbor's property that the rainwater dripping from your eaves, the edge of your roof, would fall onto their land. This created a legally required gap, a sort of no man's land between houses. Disputes over eavesdrop were a common feature of local courts. It was a law that proves that arguments over property lines and annoying neighbors are not a modern invention. The medieval version of your tree is shedding leaves in my yard. Your roof is dripping sinfully upon my cabbages. The deeply ingrained custom of hospitality in medieval society has been the subject of much academic debate. The traditional and more romantic view is that the emphasis on providing shelter and food to strangers was a direct reflection of Christian ethics. Charity, compassion, and care for pilgrims and the poor were seen as fundamental Christian duties. In this interpretation, the medieval world, for all its brutality, possessed a strong communitarian spirit. Hospitality was a moral imperative, a sign of a society that, at its core, believed in looking after the vulnerable and welcoming the stranger in God's name. The great halls of monasteries with their doors open to weary travelers are seen as the ultimate expression of this charitable ideal. However, a more pragmatic and revisionist school of thought argues that the laws and customs of hospitality were less about pure charity and more about social control and risk management. In a world without a police force, passports, or any real way to track people, a stranger was a significant potential threat. They could be a bandit scouting the village, a spy from a rival lord, an escaped criminal, or a carrier of disease. The strict rules of hospitality were a way to manage this unknown danger. By offering a stranger a place at your hearth, you weren't just being kind. You were bringing them into a controlled environment. You could observe them, question them, and hold them accountable to the community's rules. The host was responsible for their guests' behavior. If your guest robbed the village church and fled in the night, you could be held liable. In this view, hospitality was a sophisticated mechanism for neutralizing the threat of the outsider, turning a potential danger into a known quantity. It was a system that ensured a weary traveler could always find a roof over their head, a bowl of stew, and a dozen intensely curious people asking who they were, where they were going, and if they planned on murdering anyone before morning. So you decide against running away. The risks are too high. You stay on your land, you work your fields, and you try not to let your rainwater drip onto your neighbor's property. One day, a traveling pilgrim, weary and dust-covered, stops at your door asking for a drink and a place to rest for the night. You are obligated by custom and law to take him in. You'd share your meager meal and offer him a space by the fire. He tells you stories of his travels, of holy relics in distant cities. But all the while, you are watching him. You note the worn hilt of the dagger at his belt, the way his eyes dart around your small cottage. Is he truly a holy man, or is he something else?
Oh, nice.
You sleep lightly that night, your own knife tucked under your straw mattress.
Right.
The law says you must be hospitable, but it doesn't say you have to be stupid. In the morning, the pilgrim is gone, having left before sunrise. He has taken nothing but has left behind a small, crudely carved wooden bird as a token of thanks. You place it on your mantle, a souvenir from your brief, legally mandated encounter with the outside world. The wooden bird the pilgrim left on your mantle sits there for days, a small, unsettling reminder of the world beyond your village. This suspicion of the outsider, the person who is different, is a powerful force in medieval life. But the law's deepest and most violent fears were often reserved not for the wandering stranger, but for the enemy within, the neighbor whose beliefs, practices, or even just their bad luck, fell outside the accepted norm. This was the shadowy and terrifying legal realm of heresy and witchcraft, where your eternal soul was on trial, and the evidence against you could be as flimsy as a whispered rumor. The mainstream historical fact is that heresy holding beliefs contrary to the established doctrine of the Catholic Church was considered one of the most serious crimes a person could commit in the Middle Ages. It wasn't just a sin. It was high treason against God himself, and by extension, against the Christian society he ordained. The Church, with the full backing of secular rulers, established tribunals known as the Inquisition to root out and punish heretics. Similarly, the belief in witchcraft, or maleficium, the act of using magic to cause harm, was widespread. A sudden illness, a failed crop, a cow that stopped giving milk, all could be blamed on the dark magic of a witch. It was a time when your neighbor's cow dying suddenly wasn't just bad luck. It was potential evidence that you'd been dancing with demons in the moonlight again. The punishment for both heresy and witchcraft was often the same: to be burned at the stake. A death that was believed to purify the soul and destroy the evil in the body. This fear of hidden evil led to some of the most bizarre and cruel legal procedures imaginable, most notably the swimming test for witches. This was, in essence, a trial by ordeal, specifically designed for witchcraft accusations. The accused, very often a poor, elderly woman, would have her right thumb tied to her left big toe, and her left thumb to her right big toe, trussing her up in a way that made swimming impossible. She would then be thrown into a blessed river or pond. The logic was as simple as it was diabolical. Since water was a pure element used in baptism, it would reject a servant of the devil. Therefore, if the accused woman floated, the water was rejecting her, proving she was a witch. She would then be pulled out and executed. If she sank, the water had accepted her, and she was deemed innocent. Of course, by then, she had likely drowned. It was a brilliant, if horrifying, legal test from the authorities' point of view. It offered a guaranteed outcome one way or another, with the added bonus of being self-enforcing. The paperwork was minimal. The historical debate around the causes of heresy and witch trials is profound. The traditional view has long emphasized religious hysteria and genuine superstition as the primary drivers. In this interpretation, medieval society was gripped by a real and palpable fear of the devil and his agents. The church and the common people truly believed that heretics and witches posed a supernatural threat to the community, and that it was their sacred duty to identify and eradicate this evil. The trials, in this light, were a tragic but sincere expression of a society's deeply held religious beliefs. However, a more modern socioeconomic interpretation argues that these trials were often driven by much more earthly concerns. This view suggests that accusations of heresy and witchcraft were frequently used as a convenient way to scapegoat and eliminate social undesirables. The typical targets of witch hunts were not powerful sorcerers, but marginalized individuals. Poor, elderly widows who were seen as a drain on the community's resources. Midwives and herbalists whose knowledge of folk medicine was viewed with suspicion by the male-dominated clerical establishment, or simply eccentric individuals who didn't fit in. Accusing your difficult landowning widow of a neighbor of witchcraft was a very effective way to explain your sick pig and potentially acquire her property after her conviction. In this interpretation, the trials were less about theology and more about social and economic anxieties. They were a brutal mechanism for enforcing conformity and getting rid of inconvenient people. Imagine the terror. You are an old woman living alone on the edge of the village. You know a bit about herbs, which you use to help your neighbors when their children have a fever. One year the harvest fails, the entire village is hungry and afraid. They need someone to blame. They look at you, the woman who lives alone, who mutters to herself, whose cat is a little too friendly. A rumor starts. A child who you gave a tonic to gets worse instead of better. Suddenly the whispers turn into accusations. You are dragged from your home and brought before the local magistrate. Your neighbors, people you have known your whole life, refuse to meet your eyes. They testify that they saw you casting a shadow with no body, or that your milk never sours. There is no defense against such claims. You are sentenced to the swimming test. As you are thrown into the icy water, you have only two choices. Drown as an innocent woman, or float for a moment as a witch before being pulled out to burn. It was a legal system where the best way to prove your innocence was to die, which most legal scholars today agree is a significant flaw in the concept of due process.
Ow!
The swimming test, with its inescapable and cruel logic, represented the peak of trial by Ordeal's strange power. For centuries, this reliance on divine judgment had been the final answer for Europe's secular courts when earthly evidence ran out. But this entire system, which seemed so deeply woven into the fabric of medieval life, did not just fade away with time. It was brought to a sudden crashing halt by a single decree from the most powerful institution on earth, creating a legal vacuum that would change the course of Western justice forever. The mainstream historical fact is that the official end of trial by ordeal was declared at the T.F. Lateran Council in 1215. This was one of the most important and ambitious church councils of the Middle Ages. Convened in Rome by the formidable Pope Innocent III, the council issued a slate of decrees on everything from church doctrine to the conduct of the clergy. Tucked away among them was Canon 18, which delivered a fatal blow to the ordeal system. It forbade priests and all members of the clergy from participating in any judicial ordeal that involved a physical test. No priest could bless the hot iron, consecrate the water, or perform the religious rites that gave the ordeal its divine legitimacy. It was a memo from head office, so to speak, telling all the branch managers to stop throwing people in rivers to see if they were guilty. This, as you can imagine, caused considerable confusion and chaos in the legal departments of kingdoms across Europe. Without the church's participation, the ordeal was no longer a conversation with God. It was just a man forcing another man to pick up a hot piece of metal. It had lost its sacred authority. The truly strange and fascinating result of this decree was the immediate legal crisis it created. Secular courts, especially in places like England, were suddenly robbed of their primary method for resolving difficult criminal cases. For generations, when there were no witnesses and no confession, the default answer was, let God decide. Now, God was officially off the case. So what did you do with a suspected murderer when the only evidence was rumor and suspicion? This led to a period of bizarre legal experimentation. Some courts tried to muddle through, keeping the ordeals but without the priests, which quickly fizzled out. Others fell back on even older customs like compurgation, where the accused had to gather a number of oath helpers to swear to their good character. But the most significant development was the slow, reluctant, and initially clumsy adoption of a new method for determining guilt: trial by jury. The jury, which had existed in a primitive form under the Normans for administrative matters like settling land disputes, was now repurposed for criminal trials. The jury system was born not out of a noble desire for peer review, but out of sheer desperation. Judges basically turned to 12 local men and said, "We have no idea if he's guilty. You figure it out." And thus, a cornerstone of modern law was born from a collective shrug. The academic debate surrounding the Church's decision to abolish the ordeal is a classic clash between ideology and politics. The traditional interpretation is that this was a major step forward in Western intellectual and theological development. By 1215, leading church thinkers, influenced by the rediscovery of Roman law and the rise of scholasticism at universities in Paris and Bologna, had come to view the ordeal as a primitive and superstitious practice. They argued it was a form of tempting God, improperly forcing the divine to intervene in human affairs and perform a miracle on demand. In this view, the abolition of the ordeal was a triumph of reason and more sophisticated theology over folk superstition. The church was cleaning its own house, moving toward a more rational system of justice based on evidence, testimony, and confession. However, a more cynical and political interpretation argues that the decree was less about theological progress and more about a strategic power play by the papacy. Pope Innocent III was one of the most powerful popes in history. Determined to assert the Church's authority over secular kings and emperors, by forbidding priests from participating in ordeals, the Church was effectively withdrawing its seal of approval from the secular justice system. This move subtly undermined the legitimacy of the king's courts and elevated the Church's own ecclesiastical courts, which operated on a more sophisticated model of evidence and inquiry. It was a way for the papacy to demonstrate its moral and legal supremacy, asserting that the Church's justice was superior to the crude methods of kings. In this view, the end of the ordeal was not just about saving souls from superstition. It was about consolidating papal power in the long-running struggle between church and state. Whatever the reason, the impact was monumental. You, an accused person in the year 1220, suddenly find yourself in a very new and confusing situation. The hot iron has been put away. The cauldron of boiling water is now just used for laundry. Instead, you are standing in a courtroom, and 12 of your neighbors are staring at you. They are the jury. They have been sworn in to decide your fate based on what they know of you, what they've heard in the village, and what little evidence is presented. It's a terrifying prospect. These are the same men you owe money to, the same men whose chickens your dog has chased, the same men who think your beard is trimmed at a suspicious angle. Their verdict will be based on local knowledge, gossip, and gut feeling. It marked the slow legal transition from let us see if God burns his hand off To the slightly more refined let us see what Agnes from down the lane thinks she saw. It was progress, a sort, and it laid the chaotic, human, and deeply flawed foundation for the justice systems we know today. The ordeal was dead, and the jury, a clumsy and often confused substitute, was born. This chaotic transition from divine judgment to human reason marks the beginning of the end for many of the most bizarre laws we've explored tonight. But their ghosts still haunt the dusty corridors of history, and their strange legacy is woven, sometimes invisibly, into the fabric of the legal world we inhabit today. As the Middle Ages waned, the power of kings grew, and the idea of a centralized national law began to replace the patchwork of local custom and feudal whim. But the past was not so easily erased. The mainstream historical fact is that many of the fundamental principles of modern Western justice, particularly in the English common law tradition, have their roots buried deep in medieval soil. The concept of being tried by a jury of one's peers, born out of the chaotic aftermath of 1215, became a cornerstone of liberty. The idea of legal precedent, where past judgments influence future ones, began to take shape in the royal courts. And great legal documents, most famously the Magna Carta, established principles that would echo for centuries. The Magna Carta, sealed in 1215, the same year as the Fourth Lateran Council, was less a grand declaration of universal human rights and more a very specific complaint list from a group of angry barons who were tired of King John taking their stuff and generally being a menace. It included clauses like, "No free man shall be seized or imprisoned, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land." It was the original due process clause, a seed from which great legal trees would grow. But for every noble principle that has endured, there is a strange and forgotten legal quirk that has survived as a legal fossil. These are the bizarre medieval laws that, through some legislative oversight or simple inertia, were never officially repealed and technically remain on the books in some places. For example, there's a famous, though likely apocryphal law in York, England, that supposedly makes it legal to shoot a Scotsman with a bow and arrow within the city walls, except on a Sunday. There is also a law from 1313, still technically in force in the UK, that forbids members of Parliament from wearing a suit of armor in the House of Commons. It's comforting to know that while you couldn't be legally thrown in a river to prove your innocence anymore, there might still be an ancient unenforced law on the books forbidding you from frightening a horse with an unusually loud sneeze on a Tuesday. These legal remnants are a charming, if dusty, reminder of a very different world. This brings us to the final academic debate of our journey. What is the true nature of medieval law's legacy? Is our modern legal system a proud and direct descendant of medieval justice, representing a continuous, evolving tradition of liberty? This is the so-called Whig interpretation of history, which sees a straight line from the Magna Carta and the rise of juries to modern constitutional democracy. In this view, medieval law, for all its flaws, contained the essential seeds of the rights and freedoms we cherish today. It was a slow, steady march of progress, from the darkness of the ordeal to the light of rational justice. However, a more critical and less celebratory view argues that our modern legal system is not a descendant of medieval law, but is in fact a profound rejection of it. This perspective contends that the core principles of medieval justice hierarchy, collective punishment, reliance on superstition, and the fusion of church and state are fundamentally opposed to our modern ideals of individual rights, equality before the law, and secular, evidence-based reasoning. In this interpretation, the modern legal world was not born from the Middle Ages, but in reaction against it during the Enlightenment. We didn't evolve from medieval law, we overthrew it. We replaced a system that valued order over individual justice with one that, in theory, prioritizes the rights of the individual. So, is our legal DNA medieval, or is it the result of a conscious and deliberate break from that past? The debate continues to shape how we understand the very foundations of our society. As you reflect on this, you can see the truth in both sides. The language of our law is filled with medieval echoes. Terms like felony, jury, and common law all have medieval origins. Yet the spirit that animates our system, the belief that every individual is equal before the law and that guilt must be proven by rational means, feels like a world away from the strange and hierarchical justice of the past. The medieval world left us with a system that is both deeply wise and occasionally bonkers. A bit like a very old judge who dispenses brilliant legal opinions, but also insists that his hat is a protected historical landmark. It is a legacy of contradiction, a long, winding, and often bizarre journey from a world governed by God. Kings and wandering chickens to one governed, we hope, by reason. And so, our long walk through the strange legal landscape of the Middle Ages comes to a quiet close. The echoes of the manorial court have faded, the smoke from the ordeal fire has cleared, and the last stubborn, pointy-toed shoe has shuffled off into the mists of history. The world we visited tonight was one of baffling contradictions, where God's judgment was found in the healing of a burn. And a pig could be sentenced for murder, while a man could buy his freedom with a handful of silver. It was a world of laws designed to keep you in your place, to measure your worth by the color of your cloak or the ancestry of a corpse found in a ditch. But as you let these images soften and drift away, allow the sharp edges of that world to blur. Let the clatter of the courtroom give way to a gentle hush. The legal anxieties of the past are just stories now, whispers in the grand, quiet library of time. They no longer have the power to fine you for a wandering chicken or question the length of your shoes. You are safe from the scold's bridle and the trial by cursed bread. The only law that matters now is the gentle pull of slumber. Feel the weight of the day lift from your shoulders, like a heavy woolen cloak being set aside. The only verdict you await is the deep peace of a good night's rest. Let the shadows in your room be as soft as ancient velvet, and the silence be as comforting as a church sanctuary at midnight. There are no more rules to follow, no more judgments to fear. There is only the slow, steady rhythm of your own breathing. A quiet, personal law that carries you peacefully toward the morning. Rest now. The case is closed. Sweet dreams.